October of 1878. A village called Chatterton in Lancashire, England. A boy of 6 years old named Thomas Barlow leaves his mother's house on a Sunday afternoon and walks the short distance to a mill pond behind the calico works. The pond's surface is coated with a bright, unbroken layer of duckweed, a green so vivid it looks solid enough to stand on. That evening, Thomas does not come home. The next morning, a mill worker named Silas Halliwell finds his cap floating near the eastern bank. It takes 3 men with grappling hooks to recover his body from the mud beneath. When the village women prepare Thomas for burial, his mother says only one thing to the parish clerk. She tells him Jenny Greenteeth took her boy. The clerk writes accidental drowning in the register. Jenny Greenteeth's name does not appear anywhere in the official record, but every mother in Chatterton already knew whose name to use. In the year 2022, the Royal Mail released a set of first-class postage stamps under the title Mythical Creatures. One of the stamps depicts a green-faced woman rising from a weed-covered pond. Her hair is tangled with pondweed and riverweed. Her teeth are sharp and irregular. The illustration is credited as an interpretation of an old British folk figure. Her name in the accompanying booklet is Jenny Greenteeth. The Royal Mail catalogue describes her as one of the traditional supernatural beings of England's north and west. And in a single line of small print, the booklet notes that the Grindylow of the Harry Potter novels is a direct literary descendant of this figure. That last sentence is where I stopped. A National Postal Service does not usually admit in printed government stationery distributed to every post office in the country that a globally famous children's fantasy creature is a rebrand of a documented rural folk warning. But there it was, sold in stamp books, pasted onto envelopes, handed across counters from Cornwall to Aberdeen. Once you notice the sentence, you cannot unnotice what it implies. Jenny Greenteeth was not invented by an author, she was inherited by one. She was translated from a language of village testimony into a language of children's entertainment, and the translation dropped everything that had once mattered. What she was inherited from is the part of the story the Royal Mail pamphlet does not explain. Before Harry Potter, before Hogwarts, before the Black Lake, there was a network of rural belief across the north of England that named the creatures in its waters with the precision of people who had lost children to them. Not one creature, not one name, a whole taxonomy of them. Each parish knew its own water figure. Each pond had a warning attached to it. Each river had a name written into the safety instructions given to children before they were old enough to swim. In Lancashire and Cheshire, the creature was Jenny Greenteeth. She lived beneath the duckweed of stagnant mill ponds and old marl pits. Her long green fingers reached up through the surface film and grabbed the ankles of any child who leaned too far over the water. She had a mouth full of teeth stained by algae. Her hair was made of the same weed that hid her body. On the border of Yorkshire and County Durham, in the waters of the River Tees, she was called Peg Powler. The Victorian folklorist Sir William Brockie recorded in his 1886 collection of Northern folk memory that Peg Powler's hair was long and green, and that the froth on the river's surface, which locals called Peg Powler's suds, was a warning that she was awake and watching. Children in the villages along the Tees were forbidden to play near the water on any day the suds ran heavy. In Shropshire and along the Welsh borders, she was Nelly Longarms. She lived in wells and cisterns and pulled children down into the cold shafts if they leaned too far over the rim. In Yorkshire itself, in the wetlands between Halifax and Huddersfield, she was called the Grindylow. Not a metaphor, not a joke, an actual figure, feminine, aquatic, dangerous, named specifically to be feared. The word appears in the 1865 folklore records collected by the Yorkshire antiquarian Sidney Oldall Addy, who described the Grindylow as a spirit of the old moss-covered pools said to seize the ankles of trespassing children. Different names, same warning, same waters. The same creature described independently by hundreds of small farming villages across 4 counties in an era before mass. Communication could have coordinated the descriptions. Each village believed its water figure was local. What the anthropologists eventually noticed and then filed away was that the local figure had cousins in every parish for 200 miles in every direction. The most systematic collector of these accounts was a Lancashire man named John Higson, born in 1825 in the village of Droylsden, who spent the last 15 years of his life recording the folk memory of his own parish and the surrounding cotton towns before, in his own written words, the mills swallowed it. His book, Historical and Descriptive Notices of Droylsden Past and Present, was published in 1859. His larger work, contributed to the Gorton Historical Recorder in the 1860s, includes a passage that is worth quoting almost in full. Higson wrote that, in the townships of Failsworth and Newton Heath and Openshaw, mothers instructed their children from the age at which they could first walk that the ponds behind the works were guarded by a creature called Ginny Greenteeth. He recorded the belief that if a child was not obedient near the water, Ginny would rise. He recorded the specific hand gestures the mothers used when they said the name. He recorded the fact that the belief was not treated as a joke by the parents themselves. He recorded that Ginny Greenteeth was described by adults in the same tone that adults in later generations would use to describe live electrical wires. And then, Higson recorded the detail that finished me. He wrote that in Failsworth alone, between the years 1830 and 1855, 7 children were pulled from a single pond behind a cotton warehouse. 7. In one place. In 25 years. Every one of them under the age of 9. Every one of them noted by the parish as a drowning. And every one of the mothers, when interviewed by Higson himself, gave him the same name. Higson was not a folklorist by profession. He was a working local historian, a Methodist, a man with no interest in supernatural claims and no patience for exaggeration. He recorded what he was told because he understood that a warning repeated by 7 consecutive grieving mothers is a piece of testimony worth preserving. And then he died in 1871. His notes were bound into a single collection by the Manchester Free Reference Library, and nobody in the folklore establishment ever cited them again. The word Jenny Greenteeth referred to 2 things at once, and this is a detail the Folklore Society catalogue never dwelt on. It named the creature. It also named the plant, the bright green mat of duckweed, Lemna minor, a floating aquatic species that reproduces so quickly it can cover an entire pond in a single warm week, was called Jenny Greenteeth in Lancashire and Cheshire dialect through the middle of the 20th century. Villagers used the name for both without confusion. The plant was Jenny Greenteeth. The thing beneath the plant was also Jenny Greenteeth. The 2 were understood, at the level of village vocabulary, as a single warning. The plant biologist Roy Vickery, keeper of the plant records at the British Museum of Natural History in the 1980s, and later founder of the Plant Law Society, documented the double naming in his 1995 reference work, A Dictionary of Plant Law. Vickery interviewed elderly informants across northwest England who had grown up in the 1910s and 1920s, and who still, in their 80s, described duckweed with the words their mothers had used. When you saw the green mat forming, you were seeing her. The plant was her hair, or her cloak, or her hand, depending on the informant. Move away. This is the detail that turns the folklore into functional public safety. The bright green duckweed layer does 2 things simultaneously. It hides the water beneath from view, so a child cannot see how deep the pond is, or whether the bank crumbles. And it is buoyant enough, and unbroken enough, to look walkable. A small child, especially one who has never seen a pond in this state before, will step onto it expecting solid ground. The duckweed parts. The child falls through into water that may be 3 feet deep and covered in freezing mud. Every drowning that ever happened in these ponds happened this way. The warning that Jenny Greenteeth lived in the green layer was the correct warning for the physical hazard the green layer represented. The mothers who taught it were not passing on pagan superstition. They were passing on the pond safety rule that the Industrial Revolution had made necessary. The Northern English water figure did not stop at the English border. She had a family. She had documented cousins across the whole belt of Northern Europe, described by peoples who had no cultural contact with the mill towns of Lancashire, but who reported the same figure with the same features. In Norway, she was the Nokken, a shape-shifting water spirit of the fjords and forest lakes. In the 1893 painting by the Norwegian artist Theodor Kittelsen, which now hangs in the National Museum in Oslo, the Nokken is depicted rising from a still black pool at twilight, only her eyes and forehead above the water. The painting was not based on Kittelsen's imagination. It was based on a specific verbal description given to him by an elderly farm woman in the district of Telemark, who had described watching the creature from a distance across a lake as a child in the 1830s. In the German-speaking lands, she was the Nixie. The 1816 collection by the Brothers Grimm, Deutsche Sagen, records more than a dozen separate Nixie accounts from villages along the Elbe, the Weser, and the Danube. Every account describes a female figure with long hair, green or grey skin, and a preference for pulling swimmers under. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm treated the accounts as testimony, not as invention. They noted where each was collected and from whom. In Slavic countries, she was the Rusalka. Ukrainian and Russian village records from the 19th century, catalogued by the ethnographer Dmitry Zelenin in his 1916 study, describe her almost identically. Long hair, drowning behaviour, an ambush from beneath weeds and reeds. In Scotland, the version was masculine and equine, the kelpie of Highland waters, but the pattern held. A creature that looked like something else, that hid in specific waters, that killed children who ignored the warning. 6 countries, 6 languages. One creature described so consistently across regions with no communication that the most reasonable question is not whether the accounts were coordinated, but what all these people were describing. The most systematic modern attempt to catalogue every British water hag and her regional variants was the work of Catherine Mary Briggs, a folklorist based in Oxford, whose 1976 book, An Encyclopedia of Fairies, remains, half a century later, the standard academic reference. Briggs listed Jenny Greenteeth under her own headword. She listed Peg Powler separately. She listed Nelly Longarms separately. She listed the Grindylow of Yorkshire separately. She listed the Highland Kelpie separately. She listed a Welsh water creature called the Grach a Ribbin separately. She listed the Cornish Booker Doo separately. In total, in the British Isles alone, Briggs recorded more than 30 distinct named water figures who shared the same core features. Hidden in specific waters, dangerous to children, described by adults in warning tones, and whose stories had been documented independently by local antiquarians in the century before her. 30 figures, same features, same behaviour, recorded independently by 30 separate regional traditions before any national folklore infrastructure existed to coordinate them. Briggs herself, writing in the introduction to the encyclopedia, admitted that the pattern was striking and that she had no theoretical explanation for it. She noted that the accounts predated the industrial period and could not be explained purely by the presence of new industrial water hazards. She suggested, cautiously, that the figures might represent a very old and very deep human awareness of the danger posed by still water. She did not speculate further. The encyclopedia catalogued the figures and left the question open. Briggs died in 1980. Nobody in academic folklore studies has picked up the question since. Then came the Victorians. In March of 1878, in London, at a meeting attended by a small group of gentlemen scholars, a new organisation was founded. It was called the Folklore Society. Its first president was the classical scholar George Lawrence Gomme. Its stated purpose was the collection, preservation, and study of the surviving folk traditions of the British Isles. Its unstated purpose, evident in every issue of its journal from the first, was the reclassification of those traditions as objects of curiosity, rather than as records of observation. The Folklore Society did not deny that the accounts existed. It could not. The accounts filled the archives of every county antiquarian society in the country. What the Folklore Society did instead was frame the accounts. Every water creature story collected by its members was described in the journal Folklore as a survival, meaning a fragment of pre-Christian pagan belief that had somehow persisted into the modern industrial period, like an insect trapped in amber. The word survival did the entire work. It told the reader that the belief was old. It told the reader that the belief was primitive. It told the reader that the belief had been superseded by rational understanding. And it told the reader, without ever quite saying it, that no living adult should take the underlying claim seriously. Sir Edward Burnett Tyler's 1871 book, Primitive Culture, had established the framework. Tyler argued that folk beliefs were the intellectual residue of earlier stages of human cognitive development, retained by rural populations who had not yet caught up with the scientific age. The Folklore Society adopted the framework wholesale. Every water hag account was catalogued not as a warning about a specific pond, but as a museum specimen of a discarded worldview. The mothers who had told the stories to their children for 200 years were not consulted about this reclassification. The 7 Failsworth families who had buried their children in 25 years were not consulted. John Higson was already dead by the time the Folklore Society was founded, and his notes, along with the notes of hundreds of other local recorders, were absorbed into the new taxonomy and stripped of their original weight. By 1900, in the pages of Folklore, Jenny Greenteeth was a survival. By 1920, in the standard reference works, she was a cautionary figure. By 1950, in the childhood memory of anyone under 50, she was a nursery bogey used to keep children out of ponds. The Failsworth pond drownings were unrelated. The word was folklore. The case was closed. Here is where the arithmetic becomes uncomfortable. In the same decades that the Folklore Society was cataloguing Jenny Greenteeth as a discarded pagan survival, the drownings did not stop. They accelerated. The Industrial Revolution in northern England had created thousands of new bodies of water. Marl pits dug for brick clay and abandoned when the clay ran out. Mill ponds constructed to power water wheels, canal basins, reservoirs. Countless smaller pools left behind by drainage and construction. Every one of them collected duckweed. Every one of them lay near a working-class village where children played outdoors unsupervised while their parents worked 12-hour shifts. The Registrar General's annual reports for England and Wales, published continuously from 1837, allow the numbers to be checked. Between 1875 and 1900, in the 4 northern counties where the water hag beliefs had been strongest, more than 3,000 children under the age of 10 drowned in inland fresh water. ponds, canals, mill lodges, marl pits. Not rivers, not sea. Stagnant or slow-moving inland water of exactly the type the folk warnings had specified. The Victorian folklorists knew these numbers. The registrar's reports were public. But the connection was never made in print. The water hags had been reclassified as pagan survivals in one file. The child drownings had been categorised as public health failures in another file. And no member of the Folklore Society ever suggested, at any meeting recorded in the Society's minute books, that the two files might be describing the same phenomenon from different angles. The warnings that had once been given to every child in every village had been rewritten as quaint local colour. The children who had once been told to stay away from the duckweed no longer heard the name that would have made them afraid. And the ponds kept doing what the mothers had said they did. The drownings did not stop when the warnings did. In the summer of 1968, in a disused marl pit near the village of Hindley in Greater Manchester, 3 boys aged between 7 and 9 drowned in a single afternoon. The pit was covered in bright green duckweed. The eldest boy, according to the inquest reported in the Manchester Evening News on August 22, 1968, had stepped onto the weed layer believing it was solid ground. The 2 younger boys had gone in after him. The inquest recorded misadventure. Nobody at the inquest mentioned Jenny Greenteeth. The name had been out of common use for 2 generations by then. The pit is now filled in. The 3 boys are buried in the churchyard at Hindley Green. In 2002, in the village of Bacup in Lancashire, a 9-year-old boy drowned in a duckweed-covered mill lodge that had been abandoned for a century. The local paper described the surface of the water as looking like a lawn. The inquest again recorded misadventure. His mother, in a statement given to the local press, said that nobody had ever warned him that the green surface was not solid. These are 2 cases. There are many more in the coroner's records for the same post-industrial belt of northwest England. Every one of them describes the same physical scenario the Failsworth mothers had warned about in the 1850s. The physical hazard has not changed. The plant has not changed. The vulnerability of small children to floating vegetation on stagnant water has not changed. The only thing that has changed is that no child today is taught the name that would make him afraid. Then, almost a century after the last time Jenny Greenteeth was named in a coroner's inquest as anything other than superstition, the warning came back. Not as a warning, as entertainment. In 1999, in the 3rd novel of the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the English author J.K. Rowling introduced a creature called the Grindylow. In her fiction, the Grindylow was a small, horned water demon with sickly green skin and long, spindly fingers, used by the character of Professor Lupin in a Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. In the 4th novel, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Grindylows attacked Harry during the 2nd task of the Tri-Wizard tournament in the Black Lake at Hogwarts. In her later companion book, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, published in 2001 under a pseudonym, Rowling described the Grindylow as native to lakes and ponds throughout Britain and Ireland. Rowling has been open, in multiple interviews across 2 decades, that she drew on existing British folklore for many of the creatures in her books. She has cited British and Celtic mythological sources by name. What she did not do, and what the millions of children who read the Grindylow chapters did not do, was follow the borrowing back to its origin. The Grindylow of the Harry Potter series is a creature of adventure. It exists to be defeated. It attacks the hero, and the hero defends himself. The reader learns nothing about the villages that named it. The reader learns nothing about the children the villages buried. The reader learns nothing about the mothers who whispered the name over cradles in Failsworth and Openshaw and Chatterton in the 1850s. The warning has been converted into a set piece. The set piece has been sold in more than 500 million book copies globally. and the pond behind the Calico Works in Chatterton is still there, still covered in duckweed, and no child in Chatterton today has ever been told what to call the thing beneath it. I sat with the Failsworth number for 3 days before I could keep writing. 7 children, 1 pond, 25 years. Every mother giving the same name to a Methodist local historian who wrote it down because he understood that consistent testimony from grieving parents is a form of evidence, even if the coroner does not use it. That number would not leave my thinking. I kept opening the Registrar General's report for 1888, which I had downloaded as a scanned PDF from a British academic archive, and looking at the drowning column for Lancashire. 241 children under 10, in 1 year, in 1 county. And by then, Jenny Greenteeth had already been reclassified in print as a survival of Bronze Age water worship. She was in the museum. The children were in the parish register. The 2 documents did not speak to each other. They still do not. The pattern this story sits inside is larger than 1 water hag and 1 children's book. It is the pattern of what happens when a testimony that has functional value in a specific place, a warning that keeps children alive, a description that helps a community avoid a danger, is picked up by a distant institution, classified as an artifact of a superseded worldview, and then handed back to the community as decoration. The community forgets the original function. The institution takes credit for the preservation, and the danger the warning was designed to address goes on doing what it has always done, now uninterrupted by any cultural memory strong enough to stop it. The Failsworth mothers were not superstitious. They were observing that a specific pond covered in a specific plant in a specific parish had killed a specific number of specific children whose names they knew. The warning they gave was the correct warning for the danger they had documented. When Sir Edward Tyler and the Folklore Society renamed that warning a pagan survival, they were not describing what the Failsworth mothers were doing. They were describing what they, the London gentlemen scholars, were doing with the mothers' words. The mothers were doing epidemiology. The scholars were doing curation. The words were the same. The purpose was not. The same displacement has happened in the same century to almost every rural warning across every corner of the industrialized world. Warnings about specific mushrooms became legends. Warnings about specific weather patterns became superstitions. Warnings about specific animal behaviors became myths. Warnings about specific places became folk tales. And the people who repeated the warnings for generations were reclassified as unsophisticated bearers of primitive tradition, rather than as the field observers they actually were. Rowling did not cause this. Rowling inherited it. By the time she reached for the Grindylow in 1999, the creature had already been sitting in the folklore encyclopedias for a century, catalogued as a piece of quaint English colour with all of its warning function removed. She used it the way any novelist uses an inherited image, without asking why it had been made available for use in the first place. The reason it was available was that a century of institutional processing had emptied it. What she added to something already hollowed out. But the pattern goes further back than the Folklore Society and further out than any one country. Once you have seen the shape of it, you start seeing it everywhere. Ancient testimony about giants dismissed as myth. Ancient testimony about dragons dismissed as heraldry. Ancient testimony about sea monsters dismissed as marginalia. Ancient testimony about vanished cities dismissed as legend. Ancient testimony from farmers who knew their fields, from sailors who knew their waters, from mothers who knew their village ponds. All of it treated the same way. all of it processed through the same institutional filter that separates observation from record and calls the observation myth. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every category of pre-industrial knowledge that has passed through modern academic hands. Somewhere in Chatterton, or in Failsworth, or in one of the other cotton belt villages along the Medlock and the Irk and the Irwell, the mill pond that killed Thomas Barlow in 1878 is almost certainly still standing. Duckweed still grows on it. The calico works are gone. The village is now a suburb. The child who might play near the pond today does not know the name of the thing his great-great-great-grandmother would have taught him to fear. The Royal Mail stamp is still in the archive of the Royal Mail's catalogue website, printed with a small explanatory paragraph that credits the folk tradition and mentions the literary descendant without connecting the two to anything real. The book of Higson's Failsworth Notes is still in the reference room at Manchester Central Library. The Registrar General's drowning statistics are still available in the online scans of every British university library. The Nucken painting by Kittelson still hangs in Oslo. The Grimm brothers' Nixie accounts are still in print in every German bookstore. The Rusalka records are still in the Russian ethnographic archives. And the Grindylow chapter in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban has been read in bed by more children than can be counted, none of whom have been told that the creature Professor Lupin is teaching about was, until very recently, the reason their ancestors did not drown. The buildings remember. The archives remember. The stamp on the envelope remembers. The only ones who forgot were us.